Hey, everybody, welcome to Moment of Clarity. Hope you're doing well out there. Good to see y'all. Please take a second to share this. Click subscribe, click thumbs up. I got a great guest for you coming up in a minute. We're going to get into a very important topic, what's going on in Colombia, which has had major protests, major strikes. Also, on top of that, unfortunately, a lot of killing that has gone on, but we're going to get into all the details because I don't consider myself highly informed on that subject. So I figured let's bring on someone who is. This is an incredible activist, incredible person who does a lot of great work. And she's with the Washington Office on Latin America, not connected to the United States government, which you're probably not surprised with that, because if you know me and you know what I do, then no one from the United States government wants to come on my show or wants to talk to me. So you probably could have guessed that part. But without further ado, here is Jimena Sanchez. Hello.
Hi, Lee. Good to see you.
Hi, good to see you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me. So there's some not so great things, but also some kind of wonderful things going on in Colombia, which has seen a big uptick in protests, in people marching, in a national strike. And so I wish you, I'm just going to give you the floor here and let you explain to me and to everyone listening or watching what has been going on in Colombia.
Okay, well, you're right in saying that it's the good and the bad all mixed together. Unfortunately, Colombia always has wonderful things and horrible things all mixed in one. But I'll start with the bad part, which is that basically you've had a national strike since April 28th, and this is not a new strike. This was a strike that actually started in 2019, but was tampered down and basically stopped because of the pandemic and the extreme restrictions that Colombia put on all sorts of mobility and so forth. But the issues that started in 2019, were left simmering and actually made worse during the pandemic. So those issues were basically that the current ruling party, the Centro Democrático, run by President Iván Duque, basically sees that his role as a government is only to serve the interests of the wealthy, the elite, and basically the neoliberal policies of the country and not anyone else. Also, he sees that his role is to do away with the historic peace accord that was signed in 2016 after more than 50 years of internal conflict, which was quite an achievement.
Peace accord between the government and FARC, right?
Yeah, so the government and the largest guerrilla group, the FARC. He has done everything, basically, since he's been in power, to undermine it, but present to the international community as if he is advancing it. So,
undermine the peace agreement. So, yeah, they agreed to these terms, and basically the government has not met any of them, right?
Yes. So, for example, part of the peace agreement is about drug. How do you address the illegal cultivation of coca and the drug trade? And one of the agreements was made that aerial fumigation, basically with glyphosate, was going to be stopped, and a whole series of other programs that lead people to stop growing coca would be put in place, like having roads, having an economy for local campesinos, giving them protection, giving them basic services. So instead of doing that, he's been doing is pushing to go back to these militaristic policies.
Right. I think I covered recently that program, which seems so insane, but it's been pushed by the United States to dump Roundup herbicide, which we now clearly know is cancerous, just throughout the farmlands to supposedly stop the drug trade, but in fact it stops all kinds of things. It destroys all kinds of crops, all kinds of life. It gives people cancer, etc. And now Biden, and I think the program had somewhat declined, and now Biden is pushing to bring it all back.
Yeah, so the Colombian government wants it to come all back, but they have the problem that their own courts are saying that they can't do it because of health reasons. So they're trying to come up with decrees and things to advance it. So people were pissed off about that. they were also mad about all of these labor reforms that the Duque administration had started to put in place, like being able to contract people just for an hour, basically impeding collective bargaining and all of those things. And during the pandemic, special powers were given so the president could pass through different legislation without going through the usual standard overview that the Congress does. And they tried to push these things through during that time. At the same time that they were pushing all these things that were basically detrimental to the working class, Afro-Colombian, indigenous, and rural peoples, they also basically put out a relief package that in theory was supposed to help people affected by the pandemic, but in practice reached almost nobody. It reached almost nobody because of the high level of corruption that exists in the way that aid and contracts are given out in Colombia, where basically you give it to your friends and they give it to their friends. And the independent agencies in Colombia reported more than 1,000 cases of corruption of these funds. So all of this was simmering. And the response had been in 2019 to go in with full-on repression against protesters, lots of protesters killed, using the notorious SMOD, which is the anti-riot police, basically to go in and attack people while they're protesting as if they're attacking guerrillas or, basically taking a war tactic against people. Right. So people were mad about that too, but it all kind of simmered because of the restrictions. And then boom, basically in April, the president decides to introduce another reform, which was a tax reform that would basically have placed taxes on all of the basic goods and products that regular people need to survive. So in a pandemic where you had basically 8 million people out of work, another 10 million in the informal economy that hadn't been able to go out and be part of the informal economy, people got really mad and they started protesting. So there are multiple levels of this protest. One is there is a coordinating committee, which is basically all of the major labor unions in Colombia that called for the protests and called for a national strike. And then you have multiple other movements throughout Colombia, like the indigenous movement that had been doing protests for a long time. They've made more than 1,000 agreements with the Colombian government that they have not met. And then under this government, the Duque government, the government refuses to even meet with them. Does not even consider them worth meeting with, and only send the military after them, basically.
And Colombia has some of the highest levels of assassinations of activists and environmental activists, correct?
Yes. So since the signing of the peace accord, more than 1,000 social leaders, so that would be labor leaders, land rights leaders, Afro-Colombian, indigenous, campesino leaders, have been killed. And last year in 2020, even during the pandemic, when supposedly nobody was supposed to go anywhere, you had the highest number of those social leaders killed. So you almost had 200 social leaders killed, which, called into question, how is it possible that all of these illegal groups killing people are able to get through all these police checkpoints? So that's something that really should be considered there.
Right.
So you had this level of violence that had been there by, the institutions to begin with. And you also had an increasing number of massacres taking place and the government basically justifying them. So you had situations where a lot of youths were killed and the government was like, well, who knows, they're killing each other. Like basically not guaranteeing the life and safety of anyone and also not caring about it, like just being blatantly, completely expressing lack of empathy. And then you had a minister of defense defending any military action where children are killed and things like that. So all of this boiled up together and it just exploded on April 28th. People were like, we don't care about the pandemic. We want things to change. So the government responded wonderfully. They went in with multiple force. And then they started this whole international campaign to say that, well, they're attacking everybody with military force. In Cali, for example, which is one of the largest cities, the military actually sort of took over the civilian institutions. So it was kind of like a mini takeover.
Really?
You had You just had more than 2,300 abuses. You had rapes take place of women, more than 16 women publicly raped by members of the public forces. A lot of this filmed because everybody had their cell phones out. And so all of this circulating all around and so forth. And you also had last Sunday, for example, a group of peaceful indigenous people going to Cali to basically serve as like peaceful human shields for the protesters in Cali. They enter into Cali and immediately, you see this on video, there's the police and there are these guys in civilian dress shooting at them. And they basically wounded 10 indigenous leaders. And the government goes out and says, well, the indigenous people should go back to their homes, basically their reserves, as if they're not citizens of Colombia. And then you have a lot of high profile people who are friends of the government saying basically like that the indigenous are terrorists. It became this whole racist thing. And then indigenous people blaming them for having been shot at. So this is kind of the situation that we're in.
Yeah, I mean, it's unbelievable. And through all this, the United States has, at times helped the government, but just in general, never, it seems to be no condemnation, no, withdrawing of support. And meanwhile, they act like Venezuela is the real problem.
Yeah, so the United States, I would give them a 2 out of 10, if that's being nice.
That's being very nice. Yeah.
There was a unique tweet from, it's not even worth mentioning. The United States is the #1 provider of security assistance to Colombia and training to its armed forces. We have conditions on that aid through the Leahy Amendment, where it very specifically says that armed forces should not be killing civilians and things like that, should actually be protecting them or colluding with illegal groups, which they now call successor paramilitary groups, so basically paramilitary groups. And, interestingly, those conditions at this time don't apply to this anti-riot police, which I find to be very interesting. So what we've seen is 55 Democrats and even Senator Leahy calling for a review of that aid and an extension, and basically for denouncing the violence and stopping the violence and calling for major reforms. However, we're not hearing that from the Biden administration. I suspect that a lot of that has to do with the fact that Colombia has sold itself to the United States, and the United States has very much accepted it as their #1 ally in the region, especially against the crisis taking place in Venezuela. Colombia has the biggest bulk of Venezuelans that have fled Venezuela. They claim themselves to be the big humanitarians because they don't kick them out of the country, but at the same time, they're really not granting them much or more rights. And that's been another major problem. And they don't want to upset Colombia. Colombia has also really pushed a marketing narrative around the world. At first, it was the fault of somehow the dissident FARC and the other guerrilla group, which is mostly in the rural areas, behind all these protests, which is completely not understanding how the Colombian guerrillas work, nor anything that they can prove any evidence of. And then secondly, when that didn't work, they started saying that Venezuela was behind these protests, which
Right.
is absurd.
Right.
I mean, it's ridiculous. At one point, they even compared the situation to what happened in the Capitol here in Washington, saying that their democracy was under attack from these vandals and so forth. And the latest one that they've been saying is that, they uphold human rights and this is basically a big obstruction to the economy and that U.S. investment is being affected by all of this. So basically completely ignoring the fact that their own populace is completely in desperate straits, in need of reforms, in need of changes. And, they're just bulldozing on as if that doesn't matter.
I know that this question could take an hour to go through all the details, but if you could give a quick summary of what role the U.S. has played in getting Colombia to this point over the past several decades.
Sure. So, in the past 20 years, the United States started with something called Plan Colombia, which was basically an anti narcotics and military effort to do away with the guerrillas in Colombia. So, according to the US governments, including Obama and Biden, this Plan Colombia was a major success because it managed to make the FARC militarily retreat, and they killed a lot of FARC. What you don't hear is that they also killed 6,400 civilians minimally that were
Jesus.
basically forced. They were basically killed by soldiers, most of them tortured, some of them even it was targeted killings. Like they went after poor people, gay people, people that they thought were undesirable, killed them, then dressed them up as guerrillas, and then presented them as guerrillas killed in combat. So we're not talking about fog of war killings. There were a lot of those too. But this was like deliberate killings.
Yeah.
Why? Because the US was pressuring so much that they needed to show results in this Plan Colombia. So anyway, the US policy was that until 2016 when a peace accord was signed, and it changed to a predominantly peace agenda and what was known as Peace Colombia, although part of the package, still, half of it at least, continued to be aid for the security services in Colombia and anti-narcotics and these helicopters and things like that, which are really, really expensive. So the US has been completely part of this conflict. I always say the US is the third actor in the conflict, because it's been the one that's sort of been taking sides and also behind a lot of that violence and militarization that we have seen has been completely antithesis of what Colombia needs.
Yeah. And where does it look like the strike is going now? Is it ongoing and the protests are ongoing, or has the attack on them been so aggressive in the past few days that it could start fading?
So on the positive side, we've seen a whole bunch of new movements arise from this that were really kind of quiet and I would say like apathetic. Colombia has been through so much war and so much violence, that basically the urban youth, the more middle class urban youth basically didn't want anything to do with any of these issues. This was something in the rural areas, whatever. We just want to find a way for ourselves. Well, this has shown how the government has been for many years in those rural areas to that other Colombia that hadn't seen it before. And I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon. So I predict that, the worst case scenario is that the government is going to declare something called a state of commotion, which is like a state of emergency to justify basically blanketly authorizing all sorts of military control in the country and reforms that would allow them to even get themselves to stay in power longer than they should, because we have elections coming up in 2020, and right now the polls
you said 2020.
I mean 2022, and the polls are saying that the current popularity of the ruling party is very low, and so they're very concerned about that. So that would be the worst case scenario. The more likely scenario is that we're going to see ongoing violence. We're going to see moments where the protests continue, maybe some wins, but it's going to be like this until 2022. The dialogue that is taking place, first of all, the government initially called for a dialogue with all their friends. So the business community, the evangelicals that are very much supporting them, that kind of thing. And, maybe a table here or there meeting with the Civic Strike Committee. Nothing with the indigenous.
Right.
The indigenous Afro, not even part of this. And so that was a total joke. However, the Civic Committee has agreed to take this on. And, they have 16 points of what they want. The first one being implement the peace. And, they're going to try to do that. So there may be lulls in this as there may be talks. But it's out of even their control. You're seeing neighborhoods where youth have just joined together and for the first time ever been politically active and also responding to what they see as an assault of the state against all of them, which it is. I'm not surprised that you've seen people burning police stations when the police is literally going out and shooting people using live ammunition and all this stuff.
What, how much hope do you have that the election in 2022 will be legitimate? I know that the elections here in the United States are generally not legitimate, and then we put tons of pressure on other countries in order to rig or pressure their elections, as we've seen in so many Latin American nations. So what are the hopes in Colombia?
Okay, so Colombia needs to diversify its political parties. That's one of the problems. Entry into the political system was a major reason why you've had more than 13 guerrilla groups, because you've normally had two parties that basically just turn one the other, within a range.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
Anybody else? So the guerrillas demobilized because they formed a political party, and that political party for the first time had a chance. The last time they demobilized, they assassinated more than 3,000 of their members. So already we're seeing a lot of killings of demobilized FARC. But anyway, the point is that even if we were to have somewhat fair elections, entry into that electoral system is impeded by many things. One is that there are many parts of Colombia where people's votes are just bought because people have zero credibility in the political system. They're like, okay, just give me a refrigerator and I prefer that. I'll give you my vote. There are parts of the country where people are basically threatened into voting for people. There have been very interesting things like that happening.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's usually a high level of killings of candidates. And so we have to see whether there's a historic pact made with some of the parties, to try to gain more ground. Because unfortunately, the left has always been kind of divided in Colombia. And so, now they're trying to sort of do a pact with some of the moderates to see if they can advance. Because part of the reason that the right won the last time around was that they consolidated. They were like, we may be fewer, but we're putting all of our media behind this, all of our, and they did a lot of disinformation campaigns that and false things. For example, claiming that the peace accord was going to make everybody make their children homosexuals, like ridiculous things like that. Because the peace accord had gender rights in it and recognized that LGBT people were victims of the conflict, which is what a surprise.
Oh dear God.
So they claimed that this, was going to somehow, force this cultural thing on Colombia, and the evangelical churches got behind that and really, really pounded that. And that's how they got a lot of votes, unfortunately. So what I'm saying is that even if we have fair elections, there needs to really be a lot of reforms for those elections to really fairly represent the interests of people, given what the situation is right now.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. For those who want to keep informed or want to help out however they can, where do you recommend they go?
So one of the big problems we've seen is that in the United States, people don't know about all of this going on.
Yep.
It's not getting reported, for many reasons.
Well, because we only cover American media only covers people standing up, striking, protesting in the countries that we want to bring down or collapse. So if you're not in one of those countries, then your protests don't matter.
Yeah, so that's a big thing. And then, so we launched something called Con Líderes Hay Paz, which is a series of podcasts and media kits and social media from the perspective of several Afro-Colombian and indigenous leaders about why they want peace, what they're doing, what's going on in the areas that they live. So, for example, even in the port of Buenaventura, which is the most important port for the U.S.-Colombia Free Trade Agreement, how that free trade agreement is leading to the displacement of Afro-Colombians and how people are trying to fight back and all that. So anyway, I recommend people, basically Google Con Líderes Hay Paz or go to wola.org. You can find that information, and that gives guides for people to be able to contact their member of Congress, do speaking circles about these issues to try to get more people around the country to really bug their members of Congress about this.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Jimena. I really appreciate you being here.
Okay, thank you.
Talk soon.
Bye.
That was Jimena Sanchez with Washington office on Latin America, not connected to the government here in the United States. She would like everybody to know that. The initials are WOLA if you want to keep up with them. Obviously it's insane what's going on in Colombia. And like I mentioned to her, we don't cover it on our mainstream media because we only cover strikes or protests. Our mainstream media only covers strikes or protests that are going on in countries that we are trying to create regime change in. So you could have a tiny little protest in, like Venezuela, where every country's going to have a protest. So you can have a small little protest in Venezuela, and our media will run up and, oh, my people stand here, look at them protesting in the streets. Holy shit. Meanwhile, there's a massive national strike in Colombia. There's people fighting back, storming the streets, demanding rights, demanding they not be taxed in order to pay off the country's debts because they're already poor and oppressed. And, Rachel Maddow doesn't notice, right? Fox News doesn't notice. CNN doesn't notice. Our political fucking clowns that are in our government pretend that they don't notice. All of that has to be kept quiet because you have a far right-wing garbage government in Colombia, which means our garbage government is like in love. They're like, we just match up so well, our garbage government and your garbage government. So so they're not going to talk about these strikes. They're not going to promote them, but definitely something to keep an eye on, to keep watching the developments, to support. I'm going to wrap this up. For those of you who donated, all the money is going to those in need. If you're not watching this live, you can also donate on Venmo at Lee Camp. And we'll talk more about that on the live stream Sunday night. Please check out my 2 podcasts, Government Secrets and Common Censored. Also, there's a new Redacted Tonight every Friday. You can get that at portable.tv. I have a new website at leecamp.com. You can check that out. And I do these almost every single weekday, except sometimes. Keep fighting, everybody.